Less than a year after moving to the United States, 22-year-old British national Ellie Bentley was nearly killed in early 2024 by a hit-and-run driver in St. Louis, Missouri, who ran her over with his car. She had ducked in front of a car at 3 a.m. after hearing gunshots when the driver, 25-year-old Deontay Taylor, struck her with the vehicle. The young woman was painfully dragged along the pavement for 3 city blocks before being thrown from the vehicle. Bentley suffered severe injuries which required her to undergo multiple reconstructive surgeries after spending 2 weeks fighting for her life in the intensive care unit. She lost part of her ear, had several severed arteries, and may never regain full function of her limbs, which doctors narrowly managed to save from having to be amputated. 2 months after the accident, Bentley told local news station KSDK that Taylor locked eyes with her and looked directly at her before stepping on the gas pedal. She claimed that the accused assailant made no effort to stop and only continued to accelerate. Bentley had moved to the US in 2023 with her then-boyfriend, British soccer star Indiana Vassilev. She enjoyed the warm and welcoming atmosphere of St. Louis so much that she returned on her own in 2024 and plans to continue living there even after falling victim to terrifying violence. As it turned out, Taylor was involved in the shooting that Bentley was hiding from. When she was run over, he was fleeing from the accused gunman, 35-year-old Andre Wilson, when he struck Bentley and was subsequently charged with leaving the scene of an accident. Wilson was also arrested for his role in the incident and is currently detained without bail on charges of first-degree assault, armed criminal action, unlawful use of a weapon, and unlawful possession of a firearm. Number 15. Cameron Robertson. 41-year-old Cameron Robertson and his wife, 42-year-old Jill Robinson, were vacationing in Brooklyn, New York in September 2023 when they encountered life-threatening violence at the hands of masked gunmen. The British couple had traveled to the Big Apple to attend some concerts in the Bushwick neighborhood and were minding their own business on a sidewalk when Cameron was struck in the arm and leg with hollow point bullets. He and Jill took cover in a nearby deli, where Jill kept pressure on his wounds until paramedics arrived. Thankfully, Cameron survived his injuries and was released from the emergency room several hours later after undergoing surgery to remove one of the bullets. He later told the York Press that he believed he may have gotten caught up in an attempted hit on police officers, noting that he was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. Knowing that the situation could have turned out much worse, Cameron was grateful that he walked away with relatively minor injuries. Police investigated the case, but the shooters remain at large. Number 14. Ryan Martin. A heated confrontation between 2 drivers in downtown Portland, Oregon, escalated into a case of deadly road rage late one afternoon in October 2023, when a simple misunderstanding spiraled out of control. 47-year-old Ryan Martin was struggling to squeeze his Toyota Tundra past the Mercedes-Benz SUV that was idling in the street when the Mercedes driver, 46-year-old financier Jeffrey E. Hammond, flipped the middle finger. The exchange could have ended there, but instead Martin approached Hammond, who was loading his handgun, and tapped on the driver's side window. The men exchanged some hostile words for about 13 seconds before Hammond rolled the window down and shot Martin in the chest. Martin, who was unarmed, fell onto his back and begged Hammond not to shoot again, saying, "I'm sorry, I had a bad day." Ignoring the gravely wounded man's plea, Hammond attempted to fire another shot, but the gun jammed. He was also accused of flashing a police-like badge at Martin, despite not being a cop, and saying, "You're lucky I didn't shoot you in the head." Hammond then fired at an onlooker named Sam Gomez after noticing that he had stopped at the scene to snap photos. The bullet struck Gomez in the femur, and Hammond fled the scene, firing one more shot as he drove away. Gomez managed to continue filming the incident even after collapsing onto the ground, and he survived his injuries. Hammond was charged with second-degree murder, attempted second-degree murder, and 2 counts of unlawful use of a weapon. The accused killer's defense attorney reportedly plans to argue that he was acting in self-defense, and Hammond is awaiting trial from behind bars at the Multnomah County Jail. Number 13. Brandon Bovain. In 2022, 33-year-old Brandon Bovain left his Orangeburg, South Carolina home with his brother and girlfriend for New Orleans. The trio had decided on a whim to check off a bucket list item by attending Mardi Gras and were looking forward to the festivities. They were in the process of checking in at their hotel when Bovain stepped outside to retrieve his phone and walked into the middle of a gunfight in the parking lot. Two people were shooting at each other from inside their cars, and Bovain was struck by a stray bullet. Upon hearing the gunfire, his brother rushed outside, where he found Brandon slumped over and clinging to life. Bovain died from his injuries, and his devastated family became desperate for answers and justice as the case went unsolved. Unfortunately, their plea for information did not yield any smoking guns, and the unidentified killer remains at large. Number 12. Philip Donald Eric Gray. 38-year-old British tourist Philip Donald Eric Gray and his fiancée, 46-year-old Ruth Mary Silva de Oliveira Ribeiro, were checking out of a hotel in Praia do Combuco, Brazil, in July of 2024 when a gunman ambushed them in the lobby. The perpetrator demanded money and grabbed Mary, prompting Gray to intervene. A brief struggle ensued as the couple tried to stop the thief from taking their belongings, but the fight ended when the culprit opened fire on the pair. In a desperate attempt to protect Mary, Gray dove in front of her and wrapped his arms around her, but he was unable to prevent their attacker from fatally shooting her. Mary died at the scene, and Philip was left paralyzed from the waist down after being shot 3 times. The shooter fled the scene with a trivial amount of stolen cash, and the police soon caught up with him and 2 other suspects, who were arrested in connection with the incident. In addition to mourning the completely unexpected death of his fiancée, Gray is facing the reality that he may never walk again. Speaking with Newsflash from his hospital bed, he said he couldn't feel his legs and was waiting to undergo surgery. But he was far more upset about Mary's death and said he hadn't stopped crying since the attack. In a social media post, he explained that he wasn't even thinking about his own safety when he tried to block Mary from the onslaught of bullets, writing, "I put my life at risk because I loved her." Number 11. Bulgaria bus crash. Nearly 50 mostly Macedonian Albanian tourists were traveling back to their country through Bulgaria after visiting Turkey in November of 2021, when their bus crashed into a barrier and erupted into flames along the Struma motorway near the village of Bosnek. 7 people managed to jump out of windows and were injured, but survived, while 45 others suffocated to death in the early morning blaze. By the time the fire was extinguished, the victims' bodies had been charred beyond recognition, making it extremely difficult to identify the remains. In addition to being one of the deadliest bus accidents in Bulgaria's recent history, the tragedy marked the deadliest European bus crash in the preceding decade. While the exact cause of the crash is unclear, investigators blamed human error. While expressing his dismay over the loss of life, Bulgarian Prime Minister Stefan Yanev emphasized the importance of learning lessons from the incident and taking measures to prevent similar accidents in the future. Number 10. Caleb Gilori. As the end of 2018 approached, Casey McPherson Pomeroy and his wife Barbara welcomed a group of friends from the United States into their home on the Caribbean island of Anguilla, where they planned to ring in the new year together. Included among the guests were Casey's childhood friends, Caleb, Gilori, and Chuck Gross, and the men's wives. But the New Year's celebration never happened because something went terribly wrong the night before New Year's Eve. Paramedics and police responded to a reported medical emergency at the McPherson Pomeroy's home that night and arrived to find Caleb Gilori dead on the living room floor. Casey was having violent seizures and died a short while later at the emergency room. Both men had overdosed on cocaine and a drug called methylendioxamphetamine, better known as MDA or Sally for short, but their death certificates seemed to depict much different circumstances, with Casey's stating that he had succumbed to cardiac problems, fluid in the lungs, hypothermia, and seizures, while Caleb's causes of death were listed as asphyxiation, strangulation, both ligature and manual, multiple blunt force traumas, and seizures. Casey's wife, Barbara McPherson Pomeroy, also got sick but survived. She told investigators that she, Casey, and Caleb had gone to a beachside bar earlier that night. They ordered a single rum and coke but left it unattended in order to help Casey look for a lost flip-flop. Then grabbed the drink and shared it while they walked home. Detectives found Barbara's version of events questionable as the details kept changing. The victims' families also became suspicious about the possibility that Barbara and Caleb's wife, Carly Gilori, knew more than they were admitting to, especially since Caleb and Casey were not known to use drugs. Even if they were drug users, it would have been extremely unusual for them to spike their own drinks so heavily that it contained a lethal amount of MDA. After being questioned for 3 days, the women, Chuck Gross and his wife, Alicia, all lawyered up and stopped speaking with law enforcement. They all returned to the US and refused to return to Anguilla, even after being subpoenaed to the island in 2020. In late 2023, Anguillan authorities announced a renewed effort to get to the bottom of the case, and they're encouraging anyone with information to come forward and share what they know. Number 9. Ivanise Harris. In May of 2013, Ivanise Ivy Harris traveled from Las Vegas to Honolulu to work as an escort and celebrate her 29th birthday. She was accompanied by fellow courtesan Jill Gibbon and the women's pimp/boyfriend Mark Miles Jr. Harris and Gibbon had complicated relationships with Miles and with each other. They were both in love with Miles, which naturally bred some resentment between the women, but they were also close friends who genuinely cared about each other and strived to make their unusual arrangement work. After the Hawaii vacation, Harris planned to quit escorting. She wanted to enroll in college and get her life on track, but she would never get that opportunity because she vanished a few nights into the trip. Police were quick to turn their suspicions toward Gibbon and Miles, since it was easy to imagine a situation as delicate as theirs going terribly wrong due to jealousy. But Harris's travel companions denied any involvement in her disappearance, and with no solid evidence to detain them, detectives focused their efforts elsewhere. Surveillance footage from a local bar showed Harris talking to a man outside Kelly O'Neill's bar at 2 a.m. They left together and went to a hotel where they were seen entering an elevator together. A few hours later, the man could be seen leaving the hotel with a large duffel bag in tow and struggling to lift it into his vehicle before driving off. He returned to the hotel later that morning, but Harris was never seen leaving. 4 days after she was last seen alive, Harris's body was found inside the duffel bag, roughly 40 miles outside Waikiki in West Oahu. Her remains were too decomposed to definitively determine the cause of death, but the medical examiner concluded that she had passed away from a neck injury of some sort. Investigators identified the suspected killer as a 38-year-old married father of 4 and U.S. Marine Sergeant named Nathaniel Cosby, who was on temporary assignment in Hawaii. After killing Harris and returning to his hotel room, he got dressed and went to work like it was any other day. Cosby was charged with Harris's murder and tried in military court. He claimed that he had acted in self-defense, but was found guilty as charged and received a life sentence, along with a dishonorable discharge from the military. Number 8. Robin Gardner. After losing her job during the summer of 2011, 35-year-old Robin Gardner needed to get away from Frederick, Maryland and clear her head. She told her boyfriend of 2.5 years, Richard Forrester, that she was traveling to Florida to visit family, but in reality she took a trip to Aruba with a businessman she was secretly seeing, 50-year-old Gary Giordano. 2 days into the vacation, Gardner vanished and she hasn't been seen since. Giordano appeared at a restaurant along the shore, claiming that Gardner had been swept away in a riptide during an after-dinner snorkeling trip and police were called to the scene. Witnesses noticed that he seemed unusually calm for someone whose travel companion had just disappeared in an undertow. But by the time police arrived, he was sweating profusely. Officers noticed that he had a cut to his neck and found some details of his story questionable. Prior to Gardner's disappearance, she and Giordano were seen dining, drinking, and arguing at the restaurant. Giordano claimed that Gardner chased some sleeping pills with a few glasses of vodka before dinner. Witnesses recalled Gardner being all dolled up during the meal, making it seem odd that she would have ruined her hair and makeup by going snorkeling afterward. The woman's family also said it would have been unusual for her to spend her evening snorkeling when she typically preferred to get dressed up and go out on the town. Giordano attempted to fly back to the US on his original scheduled return date. Despite the fact that Gardner was still missing, he was picked up at the airport by law enforcement and detained for 4 months amid the ongoing investigation, which found that he had taken out a $1.5 million travel insurance policy covering accidental death. Prior to the trip, a judge ordered Giordano's release due to a lack of evidence, and he was never criminally charged in the case, but has remained a person of interest. The insurance company successfully blocked him from collecting the 7-figure payout, and he made subsequent efforts to clear his name by publishing a book and going on talk shows including Dr. Phil. Gardner is presumed dead, but the details surrounding her fate may never be known. Number 7. Kidnapped in Paradise. Located off the Kenyan coast in the Indian Ocean, the Lamu archipelago has been likened by many to tropical paradise. One of his biggest fans was a 66-year-old wheelchair-bound Frenchwoman named Marie de Dieu, who loved the islands so much that she vacationed there regularly. Unfortunately, de Dieu's dream destination became a place of nightmares in October of 2011 when a group of heavily armed Somali bandits barged into her rented bungalow on Manda Island during the morning hours and yanked her out of bed. Locals tried to intervene as the kidnappers put de Dieu onto a speedboat without her wheelchair or medication, but they were met with a barrage of bullets as the gunmen sped off with their captive. According to witnesses, the abductors had parked their boat right outside de Dieu's bungalow, leading to the suspicion that they specifically targeted the senior citizen. Kenyan authorities did everything in their power to try catching up with the fleeing boat, but the criminals managed to outrun law enforcement. De Dieu died in captivity 19 days later. Her kidnapping came just 3 weeks after a group of gunmen attacked British couple David and Judith Tebbett under the cover of night at their rented oceanside villa on the island of Quivy, just south of the Somali border. The kidnappers shot David dead and abducted Judith, then held her hostage for 6 months until her family paid a ransom. Following her release, Judith told BBC News that she felt uncomfortable upon arriving at the resort, where she and David were the only guests. The noticeable lack of visitors may have had something to do with the fact that both the British and American governments had urged their citizens to avoid vacationing near the Somali border due to a disturbing rise in violence against foreigners. After Marie de Dieu's kidnapping, the French government also issued a travel advisory. The Kenyan government blamed the kidnappings on the radicalist group called Al-Shabaab, which has ties to Al-Qaeda and controlled a vast swathe of southern Somalia at the time. Their presence caused Kenya's tourism industry to take a major downturn for several years, and while the Lamu Islands have gotten safer, travelers are still advised to use caution and avoid venturing too close to the Somali border. Number 6. Stranded in a snowstorm. An influx of tourists is nothing new in the northern Pakistani mountainside town of Muri, where local officials often impose strict limits on the number of vehicles that are allowed to enter. But the authorities were unprepared for the 100,000 visitors who flocked to Muri in January of 2022 to catch a glimpse of a winter snowfall. The town's streets became gridlocked in a traffic jam which extended all the way to the outskirts. leaving drivers hopelessly stranded bumper to bumper while a blizzard pounded the area with 5 feet of snow in just a few hours. As the vehicles became buried and trees were knocked into the street, many people abandoned their cars and sought shelter in any building that would welcome them. For those who remained in their vehicles, the situation became perilous as they went without much needed warmth, food, medical care, and other basic needs. The blizzard caused an electrical outage, putting even those who found shelter at risk of suffering from exposure to the elements. And drinking water also became unavailable. Rescue was slow to come as emergency workers became stranded in the traffic jams on their way into the town. By the time the military arrived in Mori, 22 people were dead. Most had frozen to death, while some had died from inhaling toxic carbon monoxide fumes, which were blown into their car when the snow blocked their exhaust pipe. It took 2 days for emergency responders to rescue survivors and fully clear the roads of snow. In the disaster's aftermath, many were left wondering why the authorities allowed the mass stranding to occur by letting so many cars into Mori. Officials claimed that they had received no emergency weather warnings and were under the impression that the conditions were perfectly safe for welcoming visitors. Pakistani Prime Minister Imran Khan ordered an investigation into the failures that led to the disaster, but he was also accused of blaming the tourists for failing to check weather conditions before driving to Mori. His commentary was met with harsh backlash from other leaders who argued that it's the government's duty to implement safety measures for tourists and the public. Most politicians seemed to agree that if the authorities had stopped so many people from traveling to Mori, there would have probably been no deaths. Number 5. Dustin Jackson. 36-year-old father of 5, Dustin Jackson, and his wife were waiting to fly back to California after a Valentine's Day vacation to Cancun, Mexico in 2022, when he decided to buy some chewing tobacco. Around 10 a.m. he hailed a taxi to a nearby convenience store where he couldn't find his brand of chew, so he asked the driver to take him to another store. As he exited the car, someone struck him in the head with an object and knocked him out cold. By the time Jackson awoke in a ditch in the desert hours later, it was dark out. There was a large welt on the back of his head where he had been hit. Several of his teeth were broken and his shoulder, leg, and foot were seriously injured. His body had been hacked by a machete blade to the point of nearly severing his arm at the shoulder, and his attackers had stolen his cell phone and credit card with no idea where he was. No wallet or cell phone, excruciating injuries, and an inability to speak Spanish. Jackson was stranded. He mustered up the strength to drag himself into what he thought was a police station, but was told to go away and continued to search desperately for help for several hours before a cop bandaged his wounds and drove him to the airport. Unsure of what else to do in her husband's mysterious absence, Jackson's wife had returned to the US, and he was eager to get back there as well. But without a plane ticket or a way to buy one, he was kicked out of the airport. Thankfully, a good Samaritan who spoke English offered to help Jackson and called his wife, who wired him money for a hotel room and a plane ticket. Jackson finally made it back to the US, where he spent months undergoing reconstructive shoulder surgeries. His destroyed joint was replaced with an artificial joint, but he suffers permanent nerve damage and is no longer able to work as a contractor. After Jackson went public with his story, the Attorney General in Mexico's Quintana Roo state announced that an investigation was underway, and the U.S. State Department spokesperson said that the agency was prepared to help if necessary. Updates on the case have not been forthcoming, leaving it unclear whether Jackson's attackers were ever brought to justice. Number 4. Robin and Annie Corky. During the late summer of 2016, 42-year-old Robin Corky and her sister, 37-year-old Annie Corky, departed Minnesota for a month-long holiday of a lifetime to Africa, where they explored Kenya, Tanzania, and Zanzibar, before continuing on to the Seychelles. Located off the eastern African coast, the archipelago consists of 115 islands, boasting pristine beaches, lush rainforests, and unique wildlife. On their 6th evening at the $2,000 per night Maya Luxury Resort. The Corkies were helped to their rooms by staff members after a day of drinking. After noticing a lack of activity the next morning, employees checked on the woman and found them deceased, lying in the exact same positions they had been left in the night before. There were no visible injuries to their bodies or signs of foul play, leaving many wondering how two young and healthy sisters had suddenly dropped dead. Autopsies revealed a fluid buildup in both Robin and Annie's lungs, known as an acute pulmonary edema, while Annie had also suffered swelling of the brain or cerebral edema. A pathologist concluded that the women's deadly symptoms had been caused by a combination of codeine, morphine, and alcohol. Some people remained skeptical of the findings because they found it hard to picture the sisters dying that way. But the authorities classified the incident as an unfortunate tragedy and nothing more, and the case was closed. Number 3. Ildar Rak Mulin. In 2018, 38-year-old IT worker Ildar Rak Mulin left Mississauga, Ontario, for a vacation of a lifetime to the South Pacific. After backpacking in New Zealand, he spent 2 days at a resort along Fiji's Coral Coast with plans to continue on to Malaysia, but he never made it to his next destination and hasn't been seen or heard from since. Surveillance footage from an hour prior to Rak Mulin's disappearance showed him participating in a yoga class at the resort. At the end of the session, he calmly walked away and checked out of the resort, then vanished, seemingly into thin air. He left a bag containing his cell phone and a set of keys behind at the deck where the yoga class was held and never returned for it. And records showed that he never left Fiji by plane. Rak Mulin's ex-wife attempted to report him missing after his mother called her asking if she knew where he was. She was bounced between law enforcement agencies for about a month before the report was finally filed. In the meantime, Rak Mulin's good friend Alexander Petrushev launched his own investigation into the missing man's whereabouts. 3 months after Rak Mulin disappeared, Petrushev told Yahoo News Australia that he didn't think his friend drowned or got into an alcohol-related accident, especially since he wasn't a drinker. At the same time, the Daily Hive reported that Petrushev believed Rak Mulin may have drowned and that he did not think foul play was involved due to Fiji's low crime rate. It's unclear whether he changed his mind about the possibility of a drowning or if one of the news agencies misquoted him, but media sources were consistent in their description of his frustration toward the authorities over how the case was being handled. Petrushev had attempted to get in touch with both Canadian and Fijian law enforcement for updates on the case, but got nowhere with his search for information. He said that the Canadian police blamed the Fijian police for being unresponsive to their attempts to coordinate, and the lack of urgency that the case received left him feeling like nobody cared. Rak Mulin's disappearance has remained largely absent from news headlines since August of 2023, indicating that little to no progress has been made toward finding him. Today's topic was requested by Crimson Ghost 8697, Puffin Pete, The Doxy Mama 4110, and Nikki 123BXD. If you have any other topics you'd like to learn about, subscribe and let us know in the comments section below. Number 2. Hannah Witheridge and David Miller. While backpacking through Southeast Asia in September 2014, 23-year-old Hannah Witheridge and 24-year-old David Miller stayed on the picturesque tropical island of Koh Tao. During their stay, the British nationals wandered off from a late-night party at Sairi Beach. They were found murdered just steps from their hotel room several hours later. Both victims had been bludgeoned with garden hose and wooden clubs before being left to drown in the shallow surf, with the murder weapons laying nearby. Outright chaos ensued on the 8-square-mile island as civilians and police alike did what they could to ensure that the culprit did not slip through their grasp. 2 weeks after the double homicide, authorities charged a pair of illegal 22-year-old Burmese migrant workers named Zorlin and Wai Phao with murder. The suspects were initially denied legal representation and later claimed that they had been tortured into confessing, leading to suspicions that they were merely fall guys who were being blamed for the crime in order to avoid harming the island's tourism industry with an unsolved case. Thailand's National Human Rights Commission attempted to investigate, but the local police refused to cooperate and the case proceeded to trial. Prosecutors argued that Lin and Fayo were connected to the crime scene through DNA evidence, but experts claimed that the crime scene had been compromised, and at least one forensic specialist testified that the DNA from the murder weapon did not match the defendants. Lin and Fayo were nevertheless found guilty of the double murder and sentenced to death. Their subsequent attempts to appeal their convictions failed, but their sentences were eventually commuted to life in prison, courtesy of a royal decree issued by King Vajiralongkorn. Many people remain convinced of the convicted killer's innocence, or at least skeptical of the trial's outcome. Others fear that Lin and Fayo are guilty but will eventually get their case overturned and be released back into the free world. The victims' families seem to believe that the men are guilty, but commended the king's decision to take them off death row because they do not believe in capital punishment. For now, Lin and Fayo's fight to clear their name continues. They've requested a review of their case and a retrial, but the government's response remains to be seen. Anything can happen to a tourist on vacation, and some of them are in search of extreme experiences. Stay tuned till after number 1 for when rock climbing goes wrong, in case you haven't seen it yet. Number 1. Desiree Gibbon. After working as a model and competing in beauty pageants from a young age while growing up in Queens, New York, Desiree Gibbon had a change of heart during her mid-20s. She decided to pursue a career on the other side of the camera lens as a documentary filmmaker and hoped to attend film school in Europe. To save money toward her goal, Gibbon traveled to Jamaica in 2017 to look for a bartending job while staying at her grandparents' bed and breakfast for a month. She seemed to be enjoying the trip when she suddenly went radio silent, causing her family back in the US to become concerned for her well-being. Then, just days before she was scheduled to return to New York, Gibbon's murdered body was found discarded in some bushes along a rural roadside. The deceased young woman's throat had been slashed and her body was covered in bruises. While tracing her last known movements, investigators learned that she was last seen leaving her grandparents' bed and breakfast 3 days prior to the discovery of her remains. Gibbon had left her purse behind but had taken her cell phone, which was never found. Anytime her family tried to call the phone, it went straight to voicemail. Needless to say, they were shocked when Gibbon's aunt, Peggy Brunner, received a call from the device 2 months after the murder. Brunner could hear breathing on the other end, but the call quickly disconnected, and her attempts to call the number back were unsuccessful. She missed a second call from her deceased niece's phone number a few hours later and never heard from it again. At the time of Gibbon's death, Jamaica was experiencing a surge in murders, leaving her mother, Andrea Callie Gibbon, to wonder if she had witnessed something she wasn't supposed to see and was killed in order to prevent her from going to the authorities. But Gibbon also may have been lured to her death, and these are just 2 of multiple possibilities that have been considered in law enforcement's attempts to solve the case. If anyone knows who killed Gibbon, they're keeping that information to themselves, but the slain woman's loved ones remain hopeful that someone will come forward and help bring the culprit to justice. Number 9. Lauren Sobel. In August of 2020, a New York woman was the lead climber in a group of 3 at the Mohonk Mountain Preserve in Gardner, about 60 miles north of Manhattan. 25-year-old Brooklyn resident Lauren Sobel had ascended to roughly 70 feet on a rock face and was setting up protection gear for the others. She was, according to her family, the lead volunteer and outreach coordinator at the Adaptive Climbing Group of New York, an organization that made climbing accessible to people of all ages with physical disabilities. It wasn't made immediately clear if the experienced climber was on the mountain in that capacity. While at the second pitch of triple bulges on the guide's wall, Sobel lost her grip and plummeted roughly 50 feet to the ground and rocks below. The young woman suffered catastrophic injuries in the fall and was pronounced dead at the scene. Number 8. Michael Spitz. 35-year-old Michael Spitz, a teacher from San Diego, California, was free soloing a route called Illusion Dweller in Joshua Tree National Park in January of 2022. Free soloing is widely regarded as the most dangerous form of climbing, as it involves taking on rock or ice walls without a safety rope and generally using minimal equipment. Spitz was an accomplished and confident free solo climber who, according to friends and family, had only recently begun being more open publicly regarding his endeavors. He'd free soloed roughly 5,000 feet in one day in Tarquitz, in addition to completing climbs in Red Rocks and Yosemite. He enjoyed the simplicity of the practice and seemed to come alive when things got hard, according to friend and climbing partner Brian Gillette. Spitz had free soloed the 100-foot Illusion Dweller in the past, and it was reported as being among his favorite routes. He was so comfortable with it that on January the 16th, he was warming up on the route while preparing for another climb. Unfortunately, something went wrong at around 5:30 p.m. when Spitz was nearing the top. The specifics were still being investigated as of the latest updates, but he was believed to have lost his grip or footing before dropping from the wall more than 80 feet. He succumbed to his injuries during the night and was found at the base of the Sentinel's west face the following morning. Number 7. Madeline Barbalu Quivy. Denver woman Madeline Barbalu Quivy, aged 29, sent out a message for help on October the 11th of 2021 as she was climbing Colorado's Kit Carson Peak. The woman was well equipped for the environment, and she'd reportedly explored similar terrain in the past. However, after straying from the standard route, she'd gotten cliffed out, meaning she had no possibility of descending or moving farther up. Barbalu Quivy's call for aid reached the county sheriff's office at around 8 p.m., at which point her GPS coordinates were shared with rescuers. Unfortunately, Barbalu Quivy had become stranded just hours before a winter storm struck. The search effort was aided by a Black Hawk helicopter, but inclement weather conditions and waning daylight severely impeded the mission. On day 1, the helicopter ran low on fuel and returned to base with the plan to make another pass. But strong winds enveloped the mountain and prevented it from going back in the air. Ground crews continued to push through gusts of snow and sub-zero temperatures before they were ultimately forced to turn back as well. They were able to locate Barbalu Quivy's body at around 3 p.m. on the following day and determined through aerial observation that she'd suffered a fatal fall. Rescue climbers came within 100 feet of her position, but the retrieval attempt was abandoned. Barbalu Quivy's mother eventually announced on social media that her body had been recovered and praised the search and rescue team's effort for what she deemed had been a nearly impossible task. Number 6. Lauren Warl. Lauren Kimmy Warl, an American woman living in New Zealand, was descending Castle Rock Pinnacle in the country's Coromandel Forest Park on August 19th of 2018. Warl reportedly had sufficient equipment to set up her own safety line, but on the way down, the 28-year-old clipped into old webbing. She'd likely done so to save time, but in the moments that followed, she slipped. Warl's partner, Richard Graham, helplessly watched as she fell out of view nearly 400 feet to the ground below. After calling the emergency services, Graham noticed that the heavily weathered fixed nylon webbing to which she was clipped had snapped. Warl suffered fatal injuries, and a coroner would later determine that her death would have likely been prevented had she chosen to use her own line instead of trusting the one attached to the bolts. Warl's family issued a statement in the aftermath of her passing, through which they urged other climbers to consider very carefully their reliance on equipment left permanently fixed to rock faces. Number 5. Brad Gobright. In November of 2019, veteran climber Brad Gobright and his partner, Aidan Jacobson, were rappelling down El Sendero Luminoso at El Potrero, Chico, in Mexico. The two had reportedly met on the day of the climb after 31-year-old Gobright had asked on Instagram if anyone wanted to join him. Phoenix native Jacobson, aged 26, accepted the invitation, and the ensuing ascent of the 2,500-foot wall unfolded without incident. The duo simul-rappelled down, a technique that involves two climbers descending on the side of a mountain using opposite ends of the same rope, with each of them acting as the other's counterweight. When the rope was slack and caught in some vegetation, the men misjudged the length they had on each side, with Gobright thinking that he had more at his disposal. They hadn't tied stopper knots to the ends of their respective lines, reportedly because it would cause them to get stuck. Consequently, when Gobright ran out of rope, it slipped out of the rappel device sending both he and Jacobson falling towards the ground. The latter's impact was softened by a bush and he emerged from the climbing accident with only a broken ankle. As he later recounted, he last saw Gobright bouncing off the ledge and continuing to fall. He dropped more than 600 feet, which is taller than the Washington Monument, and died on impact. Number 4. Peter Garlick. In April of 2021, Australian university student Peter Garlick was ascending Mount Noon, the 6th tallest peak in Queensland's Glass House Mountains. 18-year-old Garlick was studying for a teaching degree at the Queensland University of Technology, where he was also a well-liked member of the rock climbing group. As reported by his friends, he would often venture through Queensland's southeast and New South Wales, looking for walls on which to hone his skills. At around midday, multiple bystanders, who were later described as shaken and traumatized, watched Garlick drop from the rock face an estimated 130 feet. The circumstances leading up to the fall weren't concretely established in the immediate aftermath. The coordinator of a climbing group nearby provided first aid to the teenager before resuscitation efforts were taken over by paramedics who'd been called to the scene. Unfortunately, Garlick passed away from his extensive injuries. Noon was closed to the general public for the afternoon as a helicopter-assisted recovery operation was launched to hoist the teenager's body from the mountain. Number 3. Rebecca Ryan. 20-year-old Rebecca Ryan, a junior at the University of Vermont, was exploring a popular rock climbing destination known as Lower West Bolton with 2 friends in 2017. In the past, Ryan, an avid adventurer, had kayaked off the coast of Alaska, skied alpine trails, and picked her way over glaciers. While at Bolton, Ryan and her companions decided to climb a coarse-grained rock that formed a buttress 90 to 120 feet high. The group was not using the permanent bolts on their route called Harvest Moon and opted for top roping, a climbing technique that involved fixing an anchor at the apex of the wall. Climbers can also lower themselves in such settings with a harnessed belayer on the ground, controlling the rope. The group made several climbs and were ready to leave when Ryan went up one more time to clean the anchor. It meant resetting the rope at the top so that all their gear could be collected and ropes pulled down from the ground after a final descent. It also meant that Ryan would have threaded the rope through a piece of equipment and rappelled without assistance. A miscommunication occurred between Ryan and one of her climbing partners, whose identity wasn't released. It resulted in them removing belaying equipment and the university student expecting to be assisted on the way down, likely after realizing she'd left the piece of gear, which she needed to rappel at the bottom. Ryan didn't hear those below shouting at her to remain at the top, leaned back, and fell to her death. Number 2. Christopher Clark. 25-year-old Christopher Clark and 2 companions were climbing at Colorado's Rocky Mountain National Park over Memorial Day weekend in 2022. Clark, from Land O'Lakes, Florida, was a student pilot at the Shepherd Air Force Base. He was climbing alongside Michael Gregg and Lillian Martinez, who were both from Albuquerque. On May the 29th at around 9 a.m., an avalanche and a rockfall were reported at the Dreamweaver Couloir on Mount Meeker. The slide was witnessed by several other climbers in the area, while Clark, Gregg, and Martinez were caught in it. To reach them throughout the day, rescuers often worked in winter-like conditions, in terrain above 11,500 feet. 27-year-old Gregg was airlifted from the mountain and subsequently hospitalized at the medical center of the Rockies, while Martinez, also in her 20s, suffered minor injuries. Clark was pronounced dead, and an investigation was launched to determine the cause, initially believed to have been blunt force trauma. Number 1. Daniel Bush. Sydney rock climber Daniel Bush and a partner were on a cliff face in Australia's Blue Mountains in April of 2013. 27-year-old Bush's partner ascended first and then belayed him on a top rope. Looking back on the events that followed, Bush would remember feeling confident and claim, "I made a bigger move than I normally would have." In doing so, he slipped and the rope didn't catch him, resulting in a drop of over 130 feet. The fall, captured in a harrowing video by the man's helmet-mounted camera, resulted in him shattering both his ankles. Bush remained conscious throughout his ordeal and initially thought he was going to die. Upon realizing that the impact hadn't been fatal, he looked at the damage to his legs and found that his right foot was mangled beyond recognition, while his left was dangling around on a bit of skin. Bush spent an agonizing 3 hours at the bottom of the rock wall before rescuers reached him. In the aftermath, he was told that there was a 40% chance his left leg would require amputation below the knee after it had become severely infected. Bush's insurance claim was denied, and he launched a crowdfunding effort for surgery and, if needed, a prosthetic limb. Thanks for watching. If you were forced to migrate from your country, but you could pick any country in the world to move to, which country would you choose and why? Let us know in the comments section below.